In the first part of this lecture, we looked at an argument grounded in beneficence to sustain the idea that government has an obligation to broaden access to health care. In the last lecture, we began to consider the possibility that the government might have such an obligation grounded in the principle of justice. And we looked at three different approaches to justice: a libertarian approach, a socialist approach, and then finally a liberal approach. In this lecture, or in the end of this part of the lecture, we will consider a possible argument for the idea that all human beings have a right to health care. That would be the most solid grounding for the claim that justice demands greater access to health care. Okay, what I want to do here at the end of this lecture is to think about how one might build a case for a right to health care. And my focus here will be, again, on those three basic ways that we are thought to be equal, and how each of those ways suggests certain universal human rights. So let's think about each of those individually. So let's first consider our autonomous nature, our capacity for thinking, choosing, valuing, acting autonomously or independently or self-critically, our capacity for self-governance. If that is an essential dimension of who we are as human beings, if respect for an appreciation of the dignity that gives us is essential to our understanding of justice, essential to our understanding of what we expect from our institutions, especially our government, what rights might that mean that we have, or what of the traditional rights that we recognize in our society, particularly in Western democratic capitalist societies, which of those rights are grounded in this sense of what we are as human beings and our equality as human beings? Well, I would think surely all those rights that protect us from coercion and manipulation are grounded in this capacity for autonomy. Our freedom of speech, which makes it so that no one can coerce us to not express our autonomously held and chosen beliefs. Freedom of the press, freedom of religion, our freedom to choose for ourselves how we will relate to whatever fundamental accounts of life's meaning and purpose, whether there's a God or not, are out there. Each of us is free, because we're autonomous beings, right, to make those choices for ourselves about our religion. Indirectly, I would say all of our rights of democratic participation, our right to vote, our right to run for office, our right to join a political party, are all seen as tools to make sure that the government minimizes its interference with our individual autonomy. So those rights are to some degree indirectly grounded in our capacity for autonomy. Consider now our social nature. I've referred to this as the fact that all of us, in one way or another, is dependent upon others. I mean, first for our very existence, but also for our survival. None of us, particularly in a modern culture, are self-sufficient. But maybe most significantly, all of us depend upon friendship, community, intimacy, love for our happiness or our well-being. We need others. We depend upon others in a variety of ways. And the recognition of our social nature is the basis for our affirmation, I would argue, of all those rights that protect our freedom of association. Again, our freedom of religion, our freedom to associate with, to put ourselves in relationship with others who share our beliefs and can nurture our growth in those beliefs. Our freedom to associate with others who share our particular tastes or values or interests. Our freedom to be a part of a professional community or a professional association. And again, many of our democratic rights are grounded in this social nature because we have rights of participation, including the right to form or join political parties with others who share our views, who share our interests, who share our perspective on what government practices and policies should be. We are free to join lobbying organizations through which we attempt to impact the political process. All of that, I would argue, is a reflection of an appreciation for our social nature. And finally, of course, there is our physical nature. The fact that all of us have bodies. The fact that all of us must, if we are to live, have an environment that supports our physical nature. We are all subject to illness, to injury, and to death. And in the absence of food, shelter, protection, our lives are easily lost and our welfare undermined or made impossible. Now, clearly, our physical nature is the grounding or part of the grounding for those negative rights that protect us from harm or injury. Our right to life, our right to personal security, that is to be free from attack. Free from assault and battery, so to speak, free from being subject to murder. My own position would be, the argument that I would make is that it's also a consideration of our physical nature and the significance of respect for and the nurturing of that physical nature by our institutions, including our government, that is the most sound basis for a possible right to health care. That is to say, given our physical nature, given our shared vulnerability to sickness, to injury, and to death, it may well be the case that we should recognize a positive right to food, to shelter, to health care as a way of guaranteeing as much as possible that each of us is respected equally as a human being, because we are all equal as human beings physically, because as human beings we are all equally vulnerable to injury, illness, and death. We are only respected as human beings. We are only respected equally when we are all equally provided some kind of a guarantee to those resources we need to maintain ourselves, to survive physically. This, it would seem to me, would be the place to ground any possible or to justify any possible right to health care. Admittedly, there are some important questions to be raised about any sort of a argument for a positive right to food, shelter, or health care. The first one goes something like this. Shouldn't any fundamental, basic human right be one that is at all times and in all places realizable, one that can be honored in all times and in all places. But the problem with positive rights, the problem with the idea of a right to food, shelter, or health care is that it requires resources that don't always and everywhere exist. So does it make sense to talk about a right to health care when there have been times and there are places where no healthcare system has existed or could exist because of the limitation on resources? Related to this is, of course, the idea that the recognition of such a right and the meeting of the obligations that such a right implies could exhaust or put incredible burdens on already stretched human, especially public resources, therefore threatening other values and even other rights. Again, a critique or a worry about positive rights grounded in concern about limited or inadequate resources. Another set of concerns has to do with the taxation and other limitations on individual choices that are necessary to increase access to health care. I mean, think about all the limitations on choice that are involved with Obamacare. That all of those represent an unjust interference with individual autonomy, an unjust and unequal interference with individual liberty, creating a situation of, or reflecting a situation of deep injustice. Another concern has to do with the incentives or the disincentive that such taxation and interference represents. Many folk are concerned that the taxation on income and wealth, the limitations on the economic freedom of corporations will destroy the incentive that people have to produce wealth, will undermine the health of our economy, will undermine our overall capacity to produce wealth, and in the long run end up hurting the poor, those about whom we are most concerned, those about whose interests we are trying to respond to through this, but actually ended up hurting them more by undermining the incentives of those who work hard and produce the wealth that ultimately trickles down even to those at the bottom. A related issue about incentives has to do with the concern that to the degree we provide food, shelter, health care as a matter of right to all human beings, we undermine the incentives of all human beings to work and to produce. A profound concern that the more generous our social safety net, the more generous our provision of people's basic needs, the more we make it likely for people to become dependent and even lazy. And again, undermining the prosperity and the wealth of the society as a whole, and ending up hurting those at the bottom, the poor, both materially, but as significantly morally, to the degree such a system would encourage laziness or dependence. All serious arguments in opposition to the idea of a right to health care. Well, as you can imagine, those who support the idea of a right to health care have responses to each of those concerns. First, in response to the idea that a fundamental human right should be one that can be realized at all times and all places, independent of the resources that are available to a particular society or a government. Supporters of a right to health care will respond that even negative rights, like the right to be free from assault and battery, the right to be free from political coercion or interferences with one's individual liberty, all of that requires positive action and resources on the parts of governments. It requires courts and police and a whole apparatus of the state to guarantee and enforce those negative rights. So the argument here would be that positive rights are not unique in depending upon a certain level of resources. There are certainly are with respect to those negative rights places where the society lacks the resources to put in place the institutions necessary to protect even those negative, so-called negative rights. With regard to the idea that recognizing a right to health care would undermine all other values, the argument would be that a right to health care is meant simply to signal the priority of health needs over other goods, and simply suggesting not that health care needs must always and everywhere be met, but they must be met where the resources and the possibility exists of their being met. So it's acknowledging a right to health care is not saying that health care has to be provided at all times and all places, but it does say that where the resources and the prosperity, as in our own society, exists for making access to health care available to all, it should be done because of the priority that health care needs have. With regard to the idea that taxation is an injustice and that further taxation on those who can best afford it is an unjust expansion of the coercive power of the state, those who support a right to health care would argue that so long as democratic rights of participation exist, so long, that is to say, that as everyone has the opportunity to participate in the deliberative political process that determines what our taxes are and what they go toward. So long as one has that opportunity to participate equally with others in those decisions about tax rates and what tax monies go to provide, one cannot claim that a system of taxation, even an expansive one, is coercive or unjust. With respect to the concern about higher taxes undermining incentives to produce and undermining economic vitality and in the long run hurting the poor, many of those who advocate a right to health care would point to the European example and Canada as well, places whose taxes may be somewhat higher than our own, whose taxes on the wealthy may be somewhat higher than our own, but who do not show signs of economic stagnation or a loss of economic prosperity, as the worry suggests there would be. So many think that the examples Let me offer one final argument that I find particularly persuasive now in terms of the question of whether or not we ought to expand access to health care. And it's not exactly a justice argument. Maybe it goes back to social welfare again, but thinking about the welfare of our society as a whole and its ongoing health and viability. What many people have noticed over the last 30 or 40 years, and I may make a short video available to you that talks about this, what many folks have noticed is that inequality in the United States has simply become massive over the last 30 or 40 years. That the folks at the top, particularly in the top 5% or the top 1%, are doing massively better than in the past. And the people at the bottom, and even the people in the middle class, are struggling in unprecedented ways. What many people would argue is that this growth in inequality is unhealthy for our society as a whole, that our society is coming apart because of a lack of social solidarity, because we are increasingly becoming a society of haves and have-nots. And as I mentioned previously, there's a growing group of people in our society that seem to, their experience seems to justify the idea that they no longer have much of a stake in our society, in our country, in our way of life, because that society, that country, that way of life is not doing much for them. I think one could make the argument that serious efforts to address that inequality, including efforts to, as a part of that, an effort to make sure that everyone has access to health care, may well be essential to mending the social divide that threatens to make our society literally come apart. Well, that's it, and I hope this has given you plenty of food for thought, and that you might think hard and carefully about your own convictions as to whether or not our society, our government, should strive to make access to health care a universal thing in our society, a universal right.